Okay. Hello, I will be the chair for this one. My name is Delitho, and I will now give the opportunity to my panelists to introduce themselves before I go through some basic rules, state the motion, and invite Prime Minister to open the debate for us.
Hi, Prime Minister here. Just give me a minute. So.
All right, panelists, please do introduce yourself.
Sorry. I'm Toru, and I'm panelist here, and my preferred gender pronoun is he, him, they. Good luck.
All right, so speakers, remember, each speech is 7 minutes, first minute and last minute protected time. When you begin your speech, do introduce your name and how you prefer to take your points of information. Speakers, do avoid badgering individuals when they're giving their speeches. If they prefer typed, do type. If they prefer you to unmute, please wait 15 seconds before asking a further point of information. I will be putting timestamps in the chat box, 1 minute, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and 7 minutes, 15 seconds. The motion reads, in the Catholic Church, the seal of confessional means that a priest who hears a person's confessional cannot, for any reason, under any circumstances, tell others what they heard during the confession. Breaking the seal of confession, no matter the reason, results in that priest's excommunication and can be pardoned only by the Pope. This House supports policies that limit the seal of confessional. Example, California, lawmakers limited it in the cases of child sexual abuse. Once more, this House supports policies that limit the seal of confessional. Example, in California, lawmakers limited it in cases of child sexual abuse. Speakers also do ensure you are muted while others are speaking. With that being said, I now call upon the Prime Minister to open today's debate for us. Hear, hear.
Yeah, hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, TOI is exclusively through chat. I will be looking at the chat space, so please don't unmute yourself to ask me a point. Preferably, I would request that the judges please help me put timestamps at 4 and 5 also. Also at 1 and at 6. Thank you very much. Just a sec, I'm trying to get stuff. Just a sec, please.
If you're speaking, you're still on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. So I will start my speech, and let me just tune into the chat space. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think it is very problematic that individuals get to value like certain types of religious freedom over societal safety, or more importantly, societal justice. The reason why this debate exists is to interrogate why individuals should necessarily have closure when victims don't. Victims of high-profile crimes that are likely to occur within the spaces of Catholic or Catholicism in and of itself. But there are a whole lot of things to really establish in terms of this debate, so that we don't have a whole lot of messy engagement coming out of side up. One is the metric for support. We think that for a couple of reasons, the reasons why we are likely to support this, because it's a very just approach, but also that the state this religion sustenance is dependent on their existence within a particular society and their adherence to certain societal values. We think that the adherence to societal values around justice is principally important, also within the context of religion. One of the principal reasons why we support this. So let's talk about why there's an incentive that exists for the church to do this, given the kind of context of the kind of world that we live in. Notice that the Catholic Church in of itself is becoming increasingly progressive. At a particular point in time, when the Pope is largely supporting things, means that seems to curb abuses against children or against minors in of itself, or pedophilia, that's so likely to occur within the Catholic Church in of itself. All of those child rights abuses are things that the Pope necessarily wants to call out. It means that in many instances, priests that cooperate with the government are likely to get pardoned on our side of the house. For this reason, we are happy to propose this motion. But also, we think that for the fact that this is consistent with all of the outcomes that the Catholic Church in of itself is pushing for, it means that we are less likely to generate a whole lot of significant amount of backlash as a priest, while you are also likely to do this on our side of the house. Let's look at the alternative that they might propose on their side. We think that the alternative comparative that exists on their side is that this individual doesn't do this in and of itself. We think that this is principally wrong and principally incorrect for a whole lot of reasons I'm going to give to you within the speech. But notice why on their side of the house, the kind of alternative that you have is the alternative that exists within the status quo, that the state continues with the kind of limited amount of information that it has to chase down criminals. Notice that is unlikely to happen for a number of reasons, and the state has to utilize the information that exists within that confessional, within such confessionals, in order for the state to be able to apprehend these criminals and create some certain semblance of justice within that state. But notice why the argument around religious freedom breaks down in the debate. Because understand that the confessional sin is not a divine construct, but an artificial construct by individuals in of itself. So notice that for the fact that the punishment that exists for breaking the confessional sin is not a punishment that comes out from God, it's a punishment that comes out from the Pope, means that it's not a construct that is inherent or intrinsic to that religion. It means that when we take down that concept, we don't take down the concept of individuals having religious freedom, given that the idea of the confessional sin is not inherent or intrinsic to that religion in of itself. It's just an artificial construct that exists for individuals. We are proud to propose this motion. We think that for the fact that this is an artificial construct by individuals, we in no way restrict religious freedom at a particular point in time when we take this down. I'll take the clarification if it's from opening up or POI.
Just quickly. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, quickly. Yeah, so why do you think states allow religions to exist as some sort of moral arbiter? Why do you think states allow religions to exist?
I think you answered it to your speech. Very nice question. So let's look at why preemptively. Let's look at why there's not likely going to be any form of opt-out within this scale of confessional hearing. Notice that even the comparative, the worst case scenario whereby individuals are likely to opt out on their side of the house, there is no comparative, or to opt in, there's no comparative value that we are able to generate as a state. It means that only one particular individual gets to benefit from getting some certain form of closure for the particular sins that they have committed. We think that this is principally bad, and it means that there's no comparative value that exists in the alternative on their side of the house. But it is that there is limited opt-out on our side of the house, given that individuals want to be able to confess their sins and derive a certain form of abstract closure within within that religious space and of itself. It means that they are much more likely to still want to come to confession and still want to confess their sins in the worst case scenario of our world. But notice that we are even happy to trade this off on their side, trade this buyout from confessional sins on our side of the house, given that there's still no comparative value that we're able to generate within status quo. But we think that we should look at the principled justification for this debate in of itself. Notice that the principle, we don't think that individuals should be able to enjoy closure at the detriment or at the expense of other individuals within society. This is a very clear principle that wins us this debate. Notice that one, that the religion exists within the state and thrives under the armpit of state sustenance and state sustainability. It means that at a particular point in time when the armpit of justice or the armpit of things like deterrence against crimes or the armpit of things like punishment for crimes are things that create that sustainable society for that particular religion to exist. It means that there exists an obligation for that religion to ensure that active deterrence against crimes, or that active pushback, or ensuring that victims have closure or trust the state system is very, very important for that religion to continue to exist and for individuals to trust that state. We think that ultimately individuals should never be able to achieve closure at a particular point in time when individuals that ought to have that closure for the fact that they are victims of that particular crime are like subjected to huge amount of like trauma, seeing that their victims are continue to live within that particular society and continue to enjoy all of the benefits of that state, but plus the religion, given that they are absolved of all of the crimes that they commit within that particular religious spaces without any form of like punishment in of itself. We think this is in principle very wrong at a particular point in time when there's a returning benefit that exists on individuals who ought not to have that benefit. We think on our side of the house, by breaking the confessional seal, we're able to take away this benefit from individuals who don't deserve it and reappropriate those benefits to individuals who are deserving of closure. This is very, very important, and for any opt-in to win, they have to take down the crux of this argument we're proud to propose. But notice why this is very, very important and why the Catholic Church is like a very, very important inroad for like being able to achieve this. Okay, closing. Okay, no, I'm not taking you. Why the Catholic Church is very, very important for being able to achieve this. Notice on their side of the house, what happens is that the likelihood of propensity for these crimes to occur within the Catholic space is very, very high. Given that there's a reduced form of accountability, but for like a number of times there are huge complaints of priests being very, very pedophilic and engaging in a whole lot of human rights abuses on their side. It means that the Catholic Church has lost faith like within general society or has lost significant amount of buy-in because they are less accountable on that particular premise. It means that the only way whereby you are able to correct the kind of appeal or the kind of way we look at the Catholic Church is given that a whole lot of the priests within that space are likely to commit all of these crimes and still likely to go scot-free, means that you have to ensure that they are culpable and accountable to society. We think that that's the only way whereby individuals have that determined that whatever the Catholic Church does is a reflection of the kind of justice system that we have within that society, or that the Catholic Church is likely to uphold justice within this particular framework. It means on their own side, you are significantly going to have less amount of buy-in into the Catholic Church, given that you are able to cover up criminals on their side. We think for like the principal reason that we are able to reappropriate justice or closure to individuals who deserve it or are worth it because they are victims of that crime, and that we are able to hold the church accountable and create some certain form of buy-in. We are very, very happy to propose this motion.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech. We now call upon the Leader of Opposition to introduce us to the opposition bench's speech.
All right, guys, can I be heard?
Yes.
Good. So I have my eyes glued to the text space. I'm going to start in, if you have a POI, text space only, please do not mute except I ask you to. All right. 3, 2, 1. Speaker, there are just two things I pick out from opening government's case. The first is that they think that these people should not have closure when the victims of their crimes do not have closure. We think that it is problematic because in their world, there are no guarantees as well that the criminal justice system or the sort of retributive justice that it offers is going to provide the kind of closure that they give these guys, like that they speak of. But secondly, it is on the engagement of the likelihood of crimes to occur, because we did not get any real picture of what a world without where this thing is spoken looks like. We think that it's simply a world where people stop attending confessions. It means that the debate is primarily about, not primarily about whether these people are going to commit these crimes or not, because we think they will, but the difference in their world is that, these guys are going to stop attending confessions. We're going to show you why this is bad inherently. But then understand that compared to the number of people who go to confess their sins in church, the number of people who go to the police to turn themselves in is significantly lower. It means that religion exists as something that people buy into a lot more than they buy into the laws and doctrines of their state. This is going to be the first argumentation I'm going to give you. Collins is going to do all of the reporters. This is on the importance of religion as a second, point of of moral accountability for citizens of a state. Understand that religion is something that does not have the basic judicial principles as the criminal justice system. It means that to a lot of citizens, they are more able to buy into the concept and ideologies within religion and those kinds of things compared to the state. It means that for these people, religion exists like a safe haven for them, more like a moral executrix, right? But then this is what it does for them. Within the confessionals, it means that when people confess their sins to priests, things like how they're enlightened on how what they do is wrong. More importantly, they are made to observe some sort of penance. Here is the evaluation on the punishment that they receive. Because these guys say, oh, there's no justice, they don't receive. They observe some sort of penance. Sometimes this penance involves things like, going to reconcile with people that they have wronged and those kinds of things. We think that our world is more reconstructive because it is it does not have things like recidivism. In our world, when people repent, it is more wholehearted, unlike where they always have this sort of animosity and grudge towards the state. When they repent, in their world, it means that the recidivism and them always going to having the ability to commit these crimes happen more and more. But on closure, we think that the process of trial within criminal justice system is one that is always going to continually re-traumatize victims of these crimes to an extent where they becomes some primary contradiction on how much closure these guys get when they are made to experience and relive all of the experiences upon which they had been originally traumatized. Now, why do we think that we do not support that kind of world? Firstly, because it ruins the sanctity of the sacrament of penance and confession, upon which a lot of people derive some sort of succor that the state is unable to provide them with, right? This is the first. But secondly, we think that it provides some sort of justice that the state is unable to, because we think that people buy into it a lot more than they buy into the criminal justice system or the constitution of the state. It means that in a world where you make people lose the inherent ability and faith in these kinds of things, we really create a worse of society. The second substantive is on the outcome analysis, basic evaluation of what happens. Because they tell us, oh, there's going to be a significant reduction in the amount of crimes that occur in their world. We don't see how this happens. Because first, what happens is that when there is a law that is passed that says, okay, when I confess to the priest that X has happened, then when I confess to the priest that X has happened, he has the ability to report me to the police. What happens is that there is going to be a significant loss of incentive for people who commit crimes in that world to want to go to the confessional. This is bad because while these are people who are also not going to turn themselves into the police, you have taken away the one opportunity for justice to be sent to the victims in terms of things like reconciliatory acts of penance. But more importantly, you have rob these people of the opportunity to have a real thorough evaluation of their actions, how it is bad, and what ways to go upon repenting. We think that this harms society inherently more. But secondly, on the primary impact that this has on the criminal justice system, because we are never able to get an evaluation of how breaking this confessional helps criminals to be put in jail as more. Let us assume that in the absolute best case scenario for them, a priest is going to report me for confessing to him that I have committed murder. We think that within the current whims of what the criminal justice CGS looks like, we are still going to consider this as hearsay. Understand why this is important. It means that while it is something that is admissible as an evidence in court, it is not enough evidence to be able to provide conviction for people who have committed these crimes. This is important because we think that if you are going to ruin the sanctity of the institution of religions and Catholicism that we have shown you has all of these pragmatic utilities for members of the state, you have to show us how that desecration is worth trading off for the kind of marginal justice that you get in your world. To an extent where you show you that even breaking this confessional is not. Secondly, again, another impact of this is that there is a potential for weaponization, because unlike popular belief, members of the Catholic Church, the members of the clergy, the priests, and those kinds of people are not people you primarily can think of as saints. It means that just like Samuel says that some of these guys are pedophiles and those kinds of things, they have the ability to be flawed to an extent where you give them a leeway that provides some sort of corroboration to whatever it is that they say. It means that in instances where due to some certain ploy, there is some sort of attempt to implicate or criminal, try to paint someone as bad. The confessional becomes a tool that is going to be used to do this, because a priest can simply come up and say, oh, this guy told me this in confession. Because of the private nature of the confessional and how people are never really going to be able to have a third-party interpretation, it becomes a case of your word against mine. We think that this significantly harms members of the society to an extent where the church and religion that they have turned to always as a tool for succor is something that has significantly become a tool that could possibly harm them in more ways than none. Speaker, the debate is about what world do we have the slighter chances or the like most marginal chances of achieving some sort of justice or self-retribution. In their world, these guys won't turn themselves to the police. So unless the police does extensive sort of like investigations, which we think still happens in our world, they are not going to be caught. But in our world, these people are still going to be able to self-retribute and discuss with priests who are going to like put into perspective the harms of their actions and help them to do better. In their world, nothing entirely happens, especially as we show you that the breaking of this confessional is only going to lead to a significant loss of trust within the Catholic Church. We are proud to oppose.
Just a moment. All right, we thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of opening government. Here. DPM, the floor is yours.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So please just give me a moment. Let me just tap out this last thing. In the meantime, POI is in the 5th minute. If you want to ask, please unmute respectfully and ask, because I will not be looking at the text space. And please don't badger, because I'm literally outside and the connection can go away anytime. So please. Right. Okay. Right. Okay, right. I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, ladies and gentlemen, let's recognize that there was no response significantly to the principle that my partner gives to you in this debate. That is to say, church exists within the framework of the state, and your existence as a church is also as a result of the state being able to do all of its duties within the criminal justice system in and of itself, right? You then owe a moral responsibility to ensure that those particular justice and everything should be done at the end of the day. You also extend the principle to talk about why there's a need for punishment to be given, to be meted out to these particular individuals in themselves. I'm going to be showing you the sort of feeble responses you get from Leader of Opposition to the sort of sophisticated analysis that my partner give in this debate. But just to recognize, right, the first response I'm going to give to them is this, because they say, well, like it's just going to be an essay on our side of the house, even if these particular individuals talk about these things. We think investigation still happens on what we hear from this particular priest, right? But OO just asserted that they're going to use it against themselves. That is to say, the priests will just use it to, paint each other back, right? We think it is just at best an assertion. No one can prove that unless you say you're a member of the church in and of itself, and like you can give us an evidence of how that is so. We want to stand to say that these people are people of high moral and of high repute. They are taught to be upright in that particular regard. There's no analysis to show how that particular sort of attack exists with this sort of policy within the church, right? But then, to the response of say, it's just an essay in and of itself within the criminal justice system, we think this is very, very flawed, because in and of itself, we take the comments of witnesses very, very seriously within CGS, most especially when those witnesses are people that are very, very close to the criminal within that particular regard, right? We think it's still working in and of itself, right? Even if we don't just accept it in absolution, right, of what they say, even though investigation is still carried out, it still helps in the form of, investigative processes that we sort of have at the end of the day. They should not deny that in and of itself, right? But notice, right, the only sort of argument that is the biggest case from their side of the house is on how there'll be buyout from confession in itself. 4 responses to this. 1, we think people are still binding to their priests, and they still, so as long that is still subscribed to Catholicism in and of itself, confession is part of their faith. So they are going to do it at the end of the day. Removing the artificial construct of maintaining confidentiality doesn't change this. But then secondly, for a criminal to go to the church means that they probably have a conscience triggering in and of itself. So it means as long as people still have conscience, criminals will still go to the church at the end of the day, right? The reason why this particular argument this second response is important is because if you're a chronic criminal, you don't give a fuck about the church anyways. So it means those buyouts are still things that is going to exist regardless from the confessional system at the end of the day on both sides of the house. But lastly, even if you don't buy all of this, we think in the worst case scenario, it's a trade-off you are willing to make for that minimalistic buyout that is going to happen, because those criminals in and of themselves should not have an opportunity to absolve themselves of the sort of harm that they have done. They have committed the crime, they should be punished for that crime at the end of the day. But then let's go to the principle clash, so that before I move to the extensions I bring to you in this debate, right? Let's talk about the first principles here. Panel, we say, no matter the contract that you have, it doesn't overwhelm that of the fundamental consensus of justice and the need to get closure for victims. And harm has been done by this criminal. There's a need for retribution. Even if you might have asked for forgiveness, reparation is owed to the victims at the end of the day. But secondly, under principles, that virtue signaling is also important, because the reason why CGS exists is not just because we want to punish, because we want to send narrative to society that this is the sort of morals that we want within society. The counterfactual on their side of the house is that people commit crime and go to the church and ask for forgiveness, kumbaya, and then they are absolved of that particular crime. OO says that, there's some sort of soft punishment due to things like, reconciling and stuff. That is very, very minimalistic and doesn't change the fact that this is also a leeway for them to live. But secondly, I've talked about the obligation of the state to those particular societies and the obligation of the church to those particular societies. The impact of this in and of itself is this, right? There's delayed investigation and absolution of criminals on their side of the house. That is to say, in principle, they violate justice in and of itself. But then secondly, most especially when the Catholic Church in and of itself is one that is already having a lot of discrepancies that the Pope is trying to call out in and of itself, right? It's imperative that we are able to ask for this sort of information and get them at the end of the day. Notice that you don't get you have lack of closure to victims on their side of the house. This is something that is likely to create backlash within the mechanism of the state. State needs to use all of the opportunities that they have to mitigate this sort of crimes. But let's talk about why the priests are still not going to suffer on our side of the house, because even though OO did not say it, you could get that from CO, right? One, church doesn't want a war with the state, right? So the Pope would likely agree to pardon these priests in and of itself, given that these sort of cases are high-profile cases. Notice that if the states had the opportunity to just investigate and not necessarily involve the church, they would have done so. It means that we need the church in this particular regard, because they are the source of those sort of information at the end of the day, which otherwise we might not be able to get, or is going to be delayed before we get that, and these criminals would have probably run away or in and of itself been absorbed of that particular crime in and of itself, right? We think this is something that the Pope would likely want to agree with us. But secondly, the justice is compatible to the tenet of Christianity and the Catholic in and of itself, and this reinstates the lost PR or the lost publicity that the church in and of itself has had towards all of those historical harm of pedophilia that is already, outgrowing within status quo in and of itself. Thirdly, church is progressive now, so they can do this to the extent where it doesn't water down religion, given that the idea of this confessional stuff is in and of itself not divine binding, but it's an artificial construct to maintain confidentiality. Because if it's divine binding, it means you are going to be receiving punishment from God if you are the priest that do this, and not from the Pope in and of itself. They don't need to, run away from this debates, right? Lastly, there's a mitigation of abuse from the state on our side of the house. One, the state respect the church, so they will not abuse these policies in and of itself, given that there are alternatives in and of itself to the state, right? If there are alternatives, states would not even need this at the end of the day. Secondly, the states also don't want to abuse the church, given that the states also have some level of power, and you need a justification in order for you to impose some policies on the church. We think if state tries to abuse this particular policy, they will revolt, right? The only thing is this, right? The states can, within rational justification, tell the people that we need this sort of thing to commit criminals to the reformative and the rehabilitative mechanism that we have created for them, and to give closure to victims in ourselves. I've responded to buyout in ourselves. Panel, please, how many minutes do I have left? Because I'm not checking the text space. Quickly.
30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Right. Just to round up, right? I've shown you why we mitigate the harm on the priests. I've showed you in and of itself how there's no propensity for abuse of this sort of policies, but I've showed you principally why there will be limited buyouts, right? We don't think buyouts will really exist. The sort of buyout that will exist is something that will happen on both sides anyways. But even if you are going to agree that buyouts exist, right, those minimalistic buyouts are things that cannot trample over things like justice, over things like closure, and the need for states to send that virtue signal at the end of the day. The sort of limited penalty that they give to this individual is not commensurate, if any, because we don't think that they even give them punishment anyways. They just allow you to absolve yourself when you say that I've received, I understand I've wronged someone and I want to, have forgiveness from God, right? You don't get forgiveness from God. You still need to be punished for your crime. We are proud to propose.
All right, we thank the DPM for that speech. We now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Am I audible, guys? All right. Unmute yourself if you want to ask a POY. Please, when you unmute yourself, just say your team name. Don't like say anything else. Just say your team name and what else did I want to say? Just say your team name so that I know who I'm picking. And also, please don't do that till like after my 3rd minute. I'm trying to set my timer here. Please just give me some time. Oh boy. Never mind. I think I'll be fine. I'll be picking it. Anyway, okay. So I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Every single principle that opening government brings into this debate to be responded to in my speech with just one particular extension, right? But they fail to understand what was like. I really explain this. He tells you that on our justice, like justice, that you have to reconcile. We also money have to keep the priest, and the priest has, of course, this confidentiality. It's just you guys can't hear me. Oh boy.
We couldn't for a moment, but you sound clearer now. So perhaps you could just start from the beginning so that we don't miss out on anything.
Okay. All right. From the beginning. Let me start from the beginning real quick. This time I think. All right. So I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, every single principle that government brings into something that they fail to do, which is the comparative of what would look like. What Ray tries to explain to you is that when people know that it's very easy for what I did to be leaked, like to the police or to the government, and I get punished for it, they're unlikely to be thrown to jail and all those particular things, right? But something you need to understand is that our world presents better, like a better model mechanism for justice, in the sense that it is all encompassing. I'll respond to justice later, but just look at how our world looks like. Because we don't think, and they concede, that people who go to confess are not like chronic criminals. There are people who are actually sorry for what they did. There are people who are looking for like ways to probably get better. I'll talk about this later, but what we're trying to show to you is that our world says that you should change, you should try to, as much as possible, reconcile with people you hurt, and we monitor you continuously, right? Because this happens, you have to go back to the priest continuously. It's almost like therapists too, who have this privilege where they can't really like leak out most of this information too, right? Something like that. So you have to check on you regularly and see if you're like you're going back to your crime or if you're reconciled appropriately. We think that this is actually important because people are then more likely to even want to reconcile with their victims. We even get better kind of closure when you know this is coming from like the person who probably hurt you, right? But just to respond to their principle on artificiality, where they say that it isn't God that designed it, so it's totally shitty. The thing to note, and that's like my POI, is that the state recognizes religion as some sort of executrix of morality, which means that the state recognizes that religious institutions like the mosque, like the church, can contribute to shaping people's morality, which like through their sermons or through their preaching, which means that's probably why the state doesn't pay taxes and all these kind of things. There's a certain level of recognition by the state that there is some sort of different niche that you guys can actually control or shape morality, and you're supposed to do it in such a way to help people, to make people better. What happens in our world is that when people recognize that this particular person is evil, because we don't think these debates like, oh, we're just going to like accept every evil person and cover the sins, basically. We're trying as much as possible to ensure that they change, reconcile with victims, and they don't do this anymore. There's already that recognition by the state. What these guys try to do from God is strawman the argument that says, oh, this could be weaponized. We don't think that could happen in all instances, but we think it's possible. What we then do on our side of the house is we show you that when these particular people come in, there's even more likelihood that they're going to be changed. Let's engage justice now. They tell you that there needs to be justice for victims. Why is this going to be problematic on their side of the house? Worst case scenario or best case scenario for them is that you try these people in court. Two things. Firstly, we don't think it is actually justice in the sense that when these people are often people who have already admitted guilt and are ready to change, oftentimes in the courts, they get less sentencing, right? Because of the fact that these people can consider they aren't like chronic criminals. They are actually people who are sorry, right? If you admit to guilt easily in court, you get less sentencing, which means you often wouldn't get the kind of silly justice that they want on their side, especially when Ray tells you you force victims to be re-traumatized by the experience. When on our side, you could easily have just probably gone to them, apologized, and tried to reconcile with these particular people. We think that that's actually better than taking them to court where they say, oh, I'm sorry, and still get less sentencing. But secondly, we don't even think punishment is full justice, right? Because these people who have been hurt would still feel the pain, right? We think this is just like Schadenfreude, where like the basic banal instinct of man that wants to see other people suffer. Because when you throw them in jail, like it doesn't necessarily do like anything major for them. We don't think that the idea of justice flies on their side, basically, right? But we also think, right, like moving forward, we think that changing like this definition or trying to like restrict these policies causes more harm like to the church, basically, because we think that as the state recognizes the church as that moral executrix, there is a certain leeway that certain things could be corrected. Like we think that the Catholic Church can probably also create some sort of penance mechanisms for like people who are pedophilic priests, right? Like that's happened. Like the church is trying to change its image, right? That's already happening. But when you do on your side, I'll take it later. What you do on your side is you change the definition, even if legally, of this kind of people to accessories, which means it isn't necessarily just a demonization of the Catholic Church, but a demonization of this particular priest. So if this particular priest comes out to confess that best case and tell the horrors of what these particular people did, they're like, oh, you knew this and you never said anything. Oh, you were there listening to this. So it paints the image to the public of these kinds of people as actually accessories. That is harmful. Firstly, because these people didn't necessarily do any wrong. All they tried to do was to help another who was probably somebody, another person who was probably somebody like some kind of crime to be better, right? What happens on the side is they're going to make these people like probably demonized by the public and probably like attacks often like on social media and stuff like that. This is actually worse than any kind of demonization of the church. When you demonize it, I'll take it now. Quickly, okay, and move on. The second thing that happens on the side of the house is the fact that you don't necessarily. Okay, continue, please.
Right. So we showed you why the CGS system is used for virtue signaling. You limit the temerity of saying that state has the power to arbitrate sort of those particular crimes when you allow for church to absorb these particular individuals.
Yeah, so the thing about virtue signaling is that it wouldn't necessarily fly if you never made it possible for like this priest to actually like comfort and like confess or to like blow this out in the open, basically. What we think on our side on the comparative is you have to weigh where you get better justice and like even for victims as well, where there's of course reconciliative penance. But last extension, and that's very important, is how this often leads to politicization. For instance, in California, which is largely controlled by liberal-minded people and atheists, right? We think what happens on their ward is you make people easily want to politicize this, right? Right-wingers who probably never even gave a shit about the Catholic Church before could probably use this as like a means or like a tool to say, oh yeah, this is like you trying to clamp down on the church, or you trying to clamp down on free speech or like conservative values, right? What happens on their ward, especially like within the District of California, what has happened is we see different people politicizing these issues, distracting the public from the fact that this is something that is supposed to be punished, which means the virtue signaling they talk about doesn't even necessarily happen oftentimes. Like we think this is problematic, especially within those kind of societies that often have like polarized like political views. Oftentimes when people could easily weaponize this, especially when people are growing antagonistic towards the state, oftentimes, right? We think this is problematic when you distract from like the main issues that ought to be discussed and where people tend to politicize this, especially within those kind of societies. This is very necessary, especially when you need to consider that on our side of the house, we don't get through all these kind of unnecessary things happening, but we are able to focus intensely on ensuring that people like get better or people improve, because like they can see these are people who are actually changed or people who actually want to change. What we tell you is that God is probably going to forgive you, but you need to do better. You need to reconcile with your victims and you need to actually improve. We think our world is better for like justice all encompassing, and we think we engage their best case scenario because these people won't even get justice if they admit in courts that they were sorry and get less sentencing. We don't think that these guys achieve anything in this debate. We're proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now invite and call upon the government member to begin the second half of this debate for us. Hear, hear.
So, Chair, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, some seconds. All right, so POIs will be taken on the text space, so do feel free to drop your POIs on the text space. No preferred gender pronouns. So anything masculine is fine, in as much as it's not insulting or degrading, that is okay. I'm good to go. Still hoping I'm audible for the very last time.
Yes.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. So at the end of the day, Speaker, the entire case of opening opposition is one that in itself isn't true to what the church, particularly the Catholic Church, in and of itself stands for. But secondly, all the assumptions they make in this debate is one that cannot be quantified in terms of like real realities and what ultimately is obtainable in the real world. Let's take them at their best. Majority of that battles be done by my way. When they argue about how it's more often leads to the politicization of the church and why this is bad for the image of the church. Speaker, you need to understand that the church in itself is very political. It's the biggest place where politics in itself is played. The church is the foundation of politics, meaning the church has politicized several ideologies and several views that in themselves have made them to transcend for 2,000 years. We think that the church in itself isn't exclusive of politics. The church in itself is the biggest pillar of politics. So the idea of politicization is something that has been ultimately rooted within the construct of the church. So we think that in itself isn't like a case in this debate fight. But the second thing they tell us about how these demystified the priests are more often demystify the church. We think already in the status quo, the Roman Catholic Church have been demystified, and even the priests themselves have been demystified on the basis that the vast majority of the congregation within the Roman Catholic Church are bailing out, are opting out of the church because they believe that the church is abhorring crimes, that the church in itself accepts people who commit graven crimes and absolve them of their crimes without necessarily seeking things like closure for the people they offend. That idea has forced the vast majority of congregation within the Catholic Church to opt out of the Catholic Church and more often opt into things like Pentecostal and Presbyterian. I think that idea of opt out that they are crying on opening opposition is one that is already going on within the church. And that is why the church has ultimately decided to liberalize their view, to democratize their view, liberalize their view in order to see some level of comeback and traction. I'm going to explain why that itself is important. So the idea of demystification is what is already going. So what the church is seeking currently is the best way to portray a positive image so that people can buy back into the church, people can come back into the church. That is what the church is pushing for currently. So this whole idea has for far too long demystified the church, so we don't think that is a new case entirely. The next idea they talk about was the idea of people bailing out of confession, that people will bail out and wouldn't necessarily want to patronize confession. Recognize that people are already bailing out of confession already in the status quo for several reasons, panel. The first, that people are beginning to see that progression in itself is important, and the idea of having one-on-one connection with God is the immediate and the most important thing. People currently prefer to stay in their rooms, meditate, and ultimately apologize to God and ask for forgiveness to God without necessarily seeing any reason to go to church to confess to any priest or any pastor, right? That level of progression has ultimately demystified the nature of confession going forward, right? So vast majority of us Catholics, we don't necessarily go to confession any longer. We believe when we sin, we lock up our doors, we cry to God, we weep to God, and we ask God for forgiveness because we believe He's always there and He will always listen to us, right? That has demystified that nature of confession. So buyout has ultimately existed. So we don't necessarily think there is a nuance in what these guys are bringing on their side of the house. They don't have any standing case. More rebuttals will be done by my way to take these guys totally out of this debate fight. Let's engage the bulk of this debate fight. Why then is it important for the church to support this fight? Panel, you need to understand, and this is something I will openly tell you. The church is an extension of the state. It's an extensive arm of the state to more able to help the state to more likely, redistribute justice, to more able to create some level of peace, to more able to create some level of sustenance within state. The reason why this is important panel is on two fronts. Firstly, is because states have ultimately seen that the church in itself exists as a moral arbiter to help them achieve their goals. This is why state more often empower state through things like, creating tax-free policy for states where churches doesn't pay tax because the government feel like, oh, you're part of us because you're in the same conquest to help us achieve the goal of a better and a progressive society, right? That ultimately means at every instant of time that individuals more often commit crimes that in themselves are antithetical to the goal of the state. There is a moral obligation for the state and for the church to more able open up and more able allow the state to grant justice to the desiring people. I think that sort of synergy is what the church and the state in and of themselves want. And this is why we have seen massive transition in the church. The fact that the church was grossly conservative to the extent in which things like same-sex marriages and homosexuals are not often discussed in the church, to a world in which progression have allowed for things like discussion of LGBT and same-sex marriages within church, to a world in which we now see the acceptance of these individuals within the church and even the Pope legitimizing these people to marry within the fence of the church. So that level of transition is just for the church to be able to blend with society, because they owe a society a moral obligation, because they are ultimately a half part of the society, and ultimately they work in line with the guidance of the state. You must also recognize on a third level that the church in itself works with the state and societal laws. Right? This is why the laws of Moses ultimately tells you that you must respect the presidents of the state and the presidents of humans and humanity. Right? And since humans are designed along statehood and along what their society views to be right and wrong, this is why the church more often are subservient to societal values and laws. That is why you get majority of religious leaders in themselves always accountable to society and accountable to the state. We think this is something that in itself is a progression. We don't necessarily think it's something that is far-fetched from their conversion and all of those things, right? But more importantly, on the second level, right, why do we think this in itself benefit the church more and redeem the lost image that the church have for far too long? Like I said in my peroration, the church has already lost traction, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, right? Have lost tractions and have lost, have lost lay faithfuls on the basis that the faithfuls and the congregation feels that the Roman Catholic Church in and of itself isn't ultimately being as open and as transparent as it ought to be. The fact that you absorb people of great crimes and more often allow them to ultimately flourish and still repeat those crimes again makes it more dire for people to understand the dogmas of the church. That's why people are opting out. More importantly, that is why states now have to legitimize certain basic laws. That is why, of recent, a cardinal was arrested for pedophilia crimes, right? This is something that is not done before. But the state has felt that the church for far too long is acting in diametrically opposing to what the state ought to be like, right? So the state now takes urgent actions against the church. For the church to redeem its image and the lost image, they need to align themselves to what the state wants and what is in the best interest of the vast majority of people. I think the nature of justice system is something that you must be very transparent with, not actually absorbing people of their camp without necessarily allowing the victims to have some element of closure, which is systemically very important. Why then is progression in this context something that doesn't atomize the priest? The priest owes accountability to the state because the priest in itself is a derivative of the state, in as much as the church in itself is derivative of the state. We are incredibly proud to propose.
All right, we thank the government member for that speech. We now call upon the member of opposition to continue the case of opposition bench. Yeah.
Hey guys. Shit, sorry. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I will be member of opposition for this round. Sorry, I'm kind of not paying attention. I'll be member of opposition for this round. I go by he, him pronouns. Just refer to me as member. POIs in the chat predominantly, don't interrupt me. I hate it and it's really annoying. I think that's generally all. So if I'm still audible, can I start?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. So panel, bits of clarification so that like this round can go very smoothly because I think it's been a mess thus far. There's one. The first thing that needs to be realized is the Pope is an extreme God in the church. He has been ordained by God to be a priest, then to be a bishop, then a cardinal, then the Pope. What that means is that his word is, to very, very many instances, perceived as decrees that directly flow from God. Yes? And then, because of this policy, to many instances, there has been a continuous premise that confession and confessional systems are good. And primarily is also rooted in biblical knowledge, like all Catholic policies are thus far, right? So some interpretation of the Bible does give legitimacy to this premise. Second of all, right, and I think this is just in response to closing government, is that closing government, the maximum extent of closing government's premises, the church becomes an extension of the state because they don't pay taxes. We think that's very ridiculous in logically speaking, but primarily because the church has existed longer than the state. It cannot be perceived as an extension of the state just simply because it doesn't pay taxes, because the state has no control over the church and shouldn't, because that's people's religion and personal life. So we think that that claim itself is insufficient to carry or fly in today's debate, right? And we find that fundamentally problematic in so many ways. But we're going to identify something that hasn't been identified thus far, the mechanism of how these policies will look like. We think they will look like this, right? Is that they would claim that priests have an obligation to speak up when they notice crimes or crimes are confessed towards them. And if they don't speak, they are conceived as aiding and abetting these crimes, and by virtue of that, culpable in these crimes. What then happens is that due to existing pressures from all across, the Pope makes a concession. Is that one, confessions are still very, very sacrosanct, but we understand that certain instances exist where you need to speak up. And in those instances, you can speak up without fear of being excommunicated. The problem that happens here is very simple. And I think this is the clarity that needs to be made, is that historically, a policy like this has been attempted and it faced a ridiculous amount of backlash, right? And this was during the imperial era. And there's a saint about it that was compelled to speak up about confession work and then chose to kill himself and die rather than speak up. The outcome of this, and the context that is crucial here, is that means that this guy that chose rather to die than speak up about confession work has become the epitome of what Catholic life looks like. And understand that is what sainthood means, that you are the perfect example of a man that should make heaven. The problem here is then this, is that one, you cannot reverse sainthood. There is no performance in the Catholic Church for that. But second of all, he's a role model for tons of Catholics, particularly Catholic priests worldwide. The outcome of this is twofold, is that there are over 1 million Catholic priests. Pardon. What it takes for chaos to occur in this instance is for a few of these Catholic priests to disagree with this policy and refuse to speak up. The outcome of this is simple, is at the point in which you find out that somebody that has done confession is primarily a criminal. Two things then happen, is that priests go on trial. But every single priest that has done confessions previously goes on trial, because they then all have the obligation to prove that every Catholic that commits a crime has never confessed this crime towards the Catholic Church before. And that becomes very problematic. One, because it leads to mass castigation of priests in the very first place. But second of all, that creates a very bad premise, because it looks like the Catholic Church is being oppressed and creates and constitutes a massive threat to society, because there are still a lot of loyal Catholics in the status quo. There are over 2 billion Catholics. All it takes is for a quarter of them to be devout, and you have a 500 million people problem. We don't think that is sustainable. But more importantly, we think some Catholic priests will openly confess to not speaking out about these things because of how sacrosanct the society is. Why? Because there's already a saint based of this. But second of all, that there is a premise of martyrdom that is consistent within religions that makes it very valued. What this means is that these priests will stand by their decisions and defend it to the death of them. The outcome of this is twofold. One is that you are either forced to send them to prison and then create a ton of problems that I'll explain later, or you have to let them go. And understand this, is that they have a lot of support, because Catholics will support them. fellow priests that agree with them or have some beliefs that are probably right-wing will agree with them. What that means is that when you let them go, you create a problem where society then doesn't see government as respectable or the ability to resist problematic governments or problematic religions in that instance. And that's just a bad look for government. But the most important harm here is towards victims. Understand that the state has already failed victims by failing to protect them. The state has also made these people the most vulnerable actors because they're now living with trauma that is particularly toxic and harmful. What that means is that the most important actors in today's debate are victims. And to the extent where we protect and create solvency for victims, we win today's debate. How do we think this world is worse off on victims? Twofold. One is the general backlash that exists within society when victims speak up, right? Because these people are then perceived as the cause for the castigation of tons of priests worldwide, right? And the entire backlash that Catholic Church will face, because at the point in which Catholic Church still does confessions, they then have to justify if everybody that has come to confess to them just confess basic stuff like lying and stealing pots of meat, rather than confessing actual stuff like crimes and financial misdoings. And that becomes massively problematic and creates a backlash on them. And that means that they automatically then also get backlash from society and fellow Catholics that stand by their priests and stand by those people. The problem with this system is twofold. Is that if it don't exist, is that these people automatically cannot heal in society, especially in a society that hates them. But you then have to realize that a lot of these victims are people that live adjacent to religion or live by religion, because that is why they become involved in crimes that need religion to speak up or be engaged in the very first place. This probably means that they probably in many instances value religion to the point where it's something that's important to them. When they then believe that they harmed their own religion and that the reason why their own religions are falling to like disrepute and harm and like going haywire, they then can never find solvency because they now have to live with the added trauma of destroying the things that they love the most. What that means is that you create no solvency for religion, no solvency for these people in the very first place. It's crucial to realize justice exists for the victim. The entire point of justice is to create solvency for people that were harmed in problematic scenarios. To the extent where you do not create justice, you create further harms by the perception or the chase of this particular perceived form of justice. You create a worse off world. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the member of opposition for that speech. We now call upon the government whip to come and conclude the debate on governance side.
Okay, Chair, just give me 30 seconds. Sorry, I'll be back. 30 seconds. Let me just finish up what I'm writing. Thank you.
Emmanuel, check your DM, check your WhatsApp DM.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the delay. Sorry. So, sure. I'll be starting in a few. I'll not be looking at the test piece. So, in case if you have POI, sorry, you can just unmute yourself and say POI. But basically, in my 50 minutes, and mostly open opposition, so that we get a kind of diagonal engagement. Okay. So, Chair, please confirm I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. So, if I'm still audible, I'll be starting my case in 3, 2, 1, go. So, panel, basically, we think closing opposition doesn't have a case in today's debate, right? I'm still going to show you why. So the first context you get from Ayafa, or the framing it gives to you, is why even their case starts becoming faulty from the member. Because that the framing he gives to you is that he said, right, these priests have in some instances or in some cases feel obligation to give some of those kind of confession or to tell those kind of confessions to the Pope because of how they necessarily feel the Pope was directly ordained by God and everything that they tell you. We think, right, logically, if this particular priest understand that to an extent they have an obligation to tell the Pope some certain confession, it simply means they're already speaking up, right? But the difference is now they're telling the Pope. Since they understand that there is always an obligation for them to confess out or to bring out or to leak out some of those kind of confession, we think it becomes very, very important also that they extend that kind of obligation for the state itself, right? Which is exactly what closing government tries to prove to you in today's debate, which I'm also going to show you why member speech was not even engaged, right? This Ayafa tells you is that these priests are going to matter themselves because they necessarily feel that what they're going to do is the best thing for them to do and they'll never leak it. And then you have a lot of priests who feel that this is the best thing, and then from there you have an upshot that priests are not killing themselves instead of them to leak those kind of truths. Panel, we don't think it is true. If it is like in the early 80s, early 90s, it would have been true, right? But we think, right, progressivity of society have made it that no priest would want to even engage in those kind of things again, right? That is how come my partner tells you how a particular priest that was engaged in philophobia act was called out and was arrested. Even the church have to call him out in the first instances. We think that idea that society is progressing and the church is also progressing simply means those kind of ideas of matters that we get in things like around 1980s can no longer exist in current society. That is how come even the church is not teaching towards things like gay marriages and allowing homosexual, etc., etc. We think this is something that is very, very important, right? The sovereignty they say that will not exist. I will show you why the sovereignty exists from our own side of the world, right? But let's engage opening opposition. So the first thing opening opposition says is that the religion has a kind of moral obligation and accountability to its members, and it should create safe haven for people that feel that they have sinned, right? Understand how my partner tells you that the church is a part or an extension of the state. In those instances, it simply means the church also owes the state an obligation, right? I think this is something that is very, very important, right? In instances where they owe the state an obligation, it simply means in majority of instances, some of those kind of crime that was being committed against the state, not just against the church, but those crimes that was being committed against the state should be should be made known to people, to be made known to the state, right? The next thing that they say to you is that people are going to run out from the church because necessarily when you understand that you confess your sin, then that the priest is going to make it. My partner clearly shows you from his speech how it is not true that necessarily even people that commit those kind of crimes no longer go to churches to confess their sins. They feel that they can still do it in their house. But Pani, understand the nuance you get from closing government on direct diagonal engagement with open opposition. Open opposition says when people go to confess their sins, they feel that God has forgiven them. That is not true. Two things. One, the idea of religion, especially Catholic Church, based on God is a merciful God that always forgive you, even if you sin 100 times, He always forgive you. Simply means this kind of guys don't feel remorse when they commit those kind of sin because necessarily when you speak to a father at that particular point, you are forgiven. You can still go back and commit those kind of crime. It simply means society doesn't get better. Those kind of crimes is not solved in those society because this kind of people still engage in those kind of crime. If open opposition, like the deputy of opposition says, in most instances, the priest serves as a kind of physiotherapist for them to make those kind of things not to happen again. But we don't think it's true. If these guys would have wanted closure for the people they offended in the first place, like the LO said, they wouldn't have made it secret to confess to the Reverend Father, for the Reverend Father not to make it. They would have gone straight to the people that they have offended and ask for forgiveness. Them going to a priest who is going to keep it secret for them simply means they understand that the priest would never leak it. Guys, understand this is something that's very, very important for closing government. It simply means these guys would not want that particular thing to leak in the first instance. They would want those kind of people that is being offended to still be offended. When you understand the nuance you get from closing closing government, right? We tell you that the state, right, the church is an extension of the state. Why is this argumentation true? And why the closing government is very, very relevant in today's debate? Understand, panel, that every individual that exists in a state shares the same rights. Your right not to offend someone is the same right as everybody owns. In instance where you violate another right of any individual, we think every institutions or mechanisms that exist in a state should call you out and make sure that you don't trespass or you don't like fight against those kind of rights of other people. But you understand that from the info letter from the motion, it says that some of these crimes these guys goes to confess are things like rape. And rape are very crimes that are very, very secretive, that even if the CGS or the police want to trace those kind of crimes, it's very, very difficult for them to even trace it. It simply means what it now does from closing government. So it tells you the offender of that kind of crime still goes back to society and feels that he's free from everything that is being committed and can still go back to commit that kind of crime because necessarily he feels that his God has forgiven him. So it means even if he says it again and go back for forgiveness, he will still be forgiven. What it now does is that the victims of those kind of crimes can never get any kind of closure. One. Secondly, those kind of offenders will still go to commit those kind of crime, right? We think it becomes very, very important that the church owns society an obligation to protect every human right that exists in society, which is exactly what Gladstone tells you, how the church is an extension of the state. The state understands the important role that the church plays in things like morality. People understand this is very, very important. In morality that the church, like the kind of moral obligation that the church holds the state is because the state trusts them very, very well to always at every particular point of instance make sure that morality is being served and morality is being upheld. We think in those instances, right, where the state, where the church cannot abhor sin, right, in those kind of instances and allow the victims to still go on being victimized because the offender necessarily understand that that particular God will necessarily forgive him. We think it is not something from closing government will buy, right? Understand this. From closing government, right? We tell you one couple of things. One, that the church owes society an obligation, both the priests, etc., etc. This is something that you get from closing government. And now the church is an extension of the state. Since the state gives it an opportunity for it to even establish in the first instance, it owes the state that obligation to make sure that things like crimes against humanity is being stopped. We think it's even the necessary reason why the church is being founded in the first instance, right? Second thing we tell you from closing government is that we think that society is being progressive, right? So progressivity of society means that some of those kind of laws, because people understand this, opening government tells you about this, we think it's very, very important, but from closing government, we extended it. Opening government tells you how those kind of laws, they are not tied back immediately the church started. It was being brought up by because necessarily people feel that they should institute those kind of laws. It simply means it was not tied to the church. We think in the instances from closing government, we not tells you that since society is progressing, right? Progressiveness of society means that some of those kind of things should be taken away. Anything that helps society to much more better from closing government, we support it.
All right, we thank the government whip for that speech. We now call upon the closing whip to come and conclude this debate for us. Here.
All right. Mine now.
Perhaps speak a little bit louder, but you're audible.
Eh?
You are audible, but speak a little bit louder.
Wait, let me check something. Is this clear? Try and use the phone. Is this clear? Is this more audible? Or should I just put up the camera?
It's more audible now.
Huh?
Please try as much as possible to ignore the background noises. I'm somewhere very close to the road, so you'll probably be hearing cars passing by, but I just hope it doesn't make my audio very unbearable. So I'll take POIs from especially opening government. So when you have a POI, just ask in the text space. I can see the text space and I'll take it. Please don't mute for any reasons. Yes. So I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. There is almost no difference between closing government and opening government. In fact, their only extension on how the church is an extension of the state is an exact reputation of what opening government cases was, right? But to respond to this argument, we have 3 claims. Note that the state exists independent of an institutions from other agencies that exist within it, which means the state protects the society, and the society is in multiple different forms. That is the reason why we have independence of the church and separation of the church and state. That is the reason why companies, factories, and other industries can have fundamental objectives that are very different from state policy. That is the reason why when you have a libertarian government, you can still have conservative factories and companies. Why? There's a recognition of live and let live principles that allow individuals to have their own independent principles diagrammatically different. What that means is this: while states might have lofty obligations of protecting individuals and doing things like making sure law and order is protected, the same obligations does not necessarily apply to different individuals and institutions like church and personal individuals. The right of bystander apathy exists, which means even if there are actions individuals take to aid states, it is not a mandatory obligation on them to do those in those instances. Enforcing that obligation could be a state overstepping its direct level of authority, but 2, creating significant harms that Ayafa has given you in this speech. Why does this apply in these cases? We think that while the church has sacrosanct obligations, it does not extend to the point of helping states fight crimes in the way OG categorized. Yes, states can do things like not condone crime or not preach things that condone crime, or not encourage individuals and encourage or discourage individuals from committing crimes. But that does not mean that states have to now give up its sinners to the church or to the state because it wants to help it fight crimes. They did not give you any analysis that justifies this outside the idea of utilitarian impact of how it to help states solve better problems. But why is that utilitarian impact insufficient? Note, in status quo, government could do things like install CCTV cameras in everyone's home. Government could do things like install trackers in everyone's body. Government could do things like install recorders in everyone's body. It will probably take a lot of money, but they'll do it. This is going to create high-level efficiency because you can stop crime and do anything. The reason why government doesn't do that, even though it's efficient, is because of the fact that it infringes on certain sacrosanct policies and principles, like right of privacy. Why is it that we do not always prioritize high-level utilitarianism over some deontological ethics? It's because states understand the limits and the extent to which its right and obligation exist and its authority extends. That is the reason why, if state allows religion to exist within it, why then should states make a law or policy that is antithetical to that religion's sustenance when it goes significantly against core fundamental objectives and directive principles of those same institutions like religion? When you want to do things like make policies that limit seal of confessionalism, these things go down to the root of Catholicism, and that in itself is a fundamental harm that state is putting upon the church to run cognitive dissonance policies to try and diagrammatically rewire itself, right? We don't think state possess the extent of authority it takes to force the Catholic Church to bend, even if there's a utilitarian concept of how it will help them fight crimes. We don't think that the way up goes beyond that. But second principle that reports this is this: a moral outcome does not place a moral obligation on anyone to do anything. So even though there's a presumption that an action will create a moral outcome, it does not automatically create a moral obligation in that regard on that actor. For example, giving money to the poor is a good thing as alms, but it's not obligatory on me as an individual, especially when that will create significant harm and disadvantage to myself. So even though, yes, a general person would perceive a moral good in the church doing this, it has significant harms and impacts to the church, which does not in any way justify them doing anything like this, even though it possesses a sense of moral outcome. That in 3 ways report OG's argument. 1, it removes the sacrosanct idea that state authority and state principle of obligation extend and outweigh other things like independent right to self-interest. 2, it removes the necessity of them extending this policy based on the fact that you can create more crime fighting. 3, it limits the extent to which state can ask religions to modify its internal ideologies to meet its core goals. That is the reason why Catholic Church only said that gay people should be allowed into families, but they did not outrightly say gay people should be allowed into the church and we now allow gay people. because church still has the right to maintain this homunculus ideology, even though it's not directly in line with what state wants, because of the fact that we understand the need for different existence. I'll take OG now before I move on. OG.
Right, two
OG,
things.
come on now.
One, right? Listen, two things. One, right? Moral responsibility exists on the church. But two, on your extension, since you concede that everybody listens to the Pope, it means all your catastrophe in your extension only hinges on the fact that the Pope might not accept this policy. We gave you 4 reasons
All right,
as to why
let's move on,
Pope
let's move on,
accepts it, because they are progressive.
Let's move on. Moral responsibility exists on the church to do things like preach piety, empathy, and goodwill, for people to do good things. Moral responsibility on the church to do things like giving out. It does not extend to them changing things like seal of confession. You cannot presume that the moral responsibility turns them to a pawn that state can control intuitively. We don't think that comparative exists. But secondly, right, Pope cannot just wake up and do this, because this principle existed before the current Pope came into existence. Why the Pope is seen as the fundamental arbiter of the church and infallible? There are some fundamental factors of religion that are sacrosanct. Ayafa tells you how these priests are the pillars of the Catholic society that fundamentally maintain the structure of Catholicism, which is a very essential, because this policy creates significant harms that harm them, that creates real life impact. What are those real life impact that Ayafa gives you that wins this debate? But before then, the last thing that CG tells you is the presumption that there is a state overriding authority over religion. We think that that authority is perfectly defined under current status quo, as we see, but it does not extend to rewiring internal policies. You should just turn the world into a libertarian atmosphere. If you view this debate from an average perspective, and not from the perspective of an atheist or someone who doesn't care about religion, you could see the fundamental realistic harms religion, especially Catholicism, face. Why do we win the debates above our opening, which is the most essential thing in this debate? Ayafa tells you that there is a persecution bias that exists in religion, where if you create a dilemma between choosing 2 wrongs, one, wrong where OG says not reporting crimes to hear in confessions is bad from state perspective, versus doing this, which is wrong from religious perspective, because you know that you're not supposed to confess. People would more likely choose the religious side, because the cognitive dissonance you create goes against everything they fundamentally believe. This will significantly impact how much they can be able to exist as priests and perform their duties, because then you create lack of reciprocity of respect for independent decision from the state to the church, because the church also respects the state. This is very wrong in principle to analyze the state into a functioning institution, because it does not function as an institution of the government itself. The impact of this is that the martyrdom narrative would cause priests to do things like not want to conduct confessions, or people just giving baseline confessions that doesn't really reveal anything. Impact of this is large, right? One, you have Catholicism, which is a religious institution that you have already given the right to exist. Why should you do this? We think that this policy is a gradual transition into an atheist atmosphere that does not care about religion. If you really care about religion and its cooperative benefit society, you will not force this hand down this kind of rabbit hole. We probably win this debate from all.